and welcome back to Bristol, It's Criminal. I'm Sheila Hannon, and sitting opposite me is Rose Wallis, Associate Professor of History at the University of the West of England. And the dark stuff we're going to be talking about now is the skeleton in the cupboard. Whose skeleton was in the cupboard?
Well, we're talking about a young man called John Horwood, who was discovered quite literally in a cupboard at Bristol University.
And I think he was discovered not that long ago.
No, we're talking about 2011. Part of their medical collections, long-standing, and I believe that they managed to identify the skeleton and then track down John's surviving relatives.
Wow.
John is also noted for being the first person to be executed from Bristol's New Gaol, opened in 1820, and John was executed on the jailhouse gates in 1821.
In fact, the gate where he was hung still survives.
Yes.
Next to Wapping Wharf. But there's also a forgotten woman in this story, isn't there?
Eliza Balsum is the young woman that we're talking about. She is the woman who John was responsible for her death. He was prosecuted successfully for her murder. That's why he was executed. But quite often her story is what gets eclipsed amidst John's story.
So yeah, let's hear about the crime. So we're in 1820. That's when all this happens, isn't it?
We're in 1821. We are a little way outside of Bristol in Hannon. Eliza and John are part of the same neighbourhood. They've known each other since they were children, and John allegedly was pursuing Eliza as his sweetheart, as his beau.
And Eliza, as I understand it, was not keen on his attentions.
Almost everything that we have suggests that she was not keen. And I think there's little doubt that ultimately he did throw the stone which caused the injury that killed her.
So this is a sort of, today would we kind of say he stalked her?
I think you could.
Yeah.
Judging by what we can see from the case, he was really, really aggressive towards her, that she was genuinely fearful, that her family intervened. John is alleged to have thrown acid over the dress that she was wearing, and that's really serious. You kind of, think about the fact that happens now and how terrifying and how potentially dangerous it is. 200 years ago,
but there's something very timeless about the story.
Yeah. So both 17, both really young people. He sees her coming sort of towards this little brook with a couple of other guys, and apparently throws the stone over that distance. It hits her in the forehead. She goes down. She isn't knocked unconscious. So there's a small wound. That's it, seemingly innocuous. They bandage the wound at home, and she carries on in that state for about 5 days, working with her mother, going to collect water. Apparently she carries, supporting it with her head, a pail of water that weighed, I think, something like 50 pounds or something. So she's carrying on regardless, doing all this stuff, until she starts to feel too sick that they admit her as an inpatient.
And I think she has the misfortune, or perhaps, to be seen by one Richard Smith, surgeon at the Bristol Infirmary.
Dr Richard Smith, important person, certainly like to think he was an important person. He does see Eliza, but she's actually attended to initially by another surgeon called Dr Estlin.
So poor old Eliza is about to be subjected to trepanning without anaesthetic. Now, of course, the strange thing as well about this is that there were anaesthetics. It's a criminal story, this, on any number of levels.
The operation takes place on February the 10th, I think by around the 12th. Smith certainly is convinced that she's in a critical way, likely mortal. So he raises the question of this being the result of an assault with the local authorities. They go and arrest Horwood, and they bring Horwood to Eliza's bedside, where the local magistrates are going to take their statements, basically. But then the whole dynamic of the two of them being interviewed together is it feels extraordinary.
It's not what we do today, is it?
No.
And it's interesting that here we have the surgeon. From what you're saying, it was he who kind of said that guy chucked a stone at her. Yeah. And he thinks at this point that she's not going to survive. Well, of course, that means that if Eliza dies, and Smith has accused Horwood of causing that death, that Horwood might be charged with murder. But this girl, who is kind of at the centre of it all and yet is sort of a mystery.
So it's one of those things where her voice really isn't captured in the record. I mean, we do have her statement, but again, her voice is being mediated through the people who are writing out the statement for her. And particularly with women, trying to kind of recover those voices, particularly as victims, is really, really difficult. We also know, though, that Eliza had a social life. If we strip back the facts that are pertinent to the criminal case, we know that Eliza was going to Christmas parties with her friends, that she was going to New Year's Eve parties and socialising with all sorts of different people, including John. And the night that she was injured, we've got all these young people hanging out in the park.
Well, I thought that was interesting what you said before, which I hadn't known, that when he chucks the stone at her, she's with two other guys.
What is really frustrating that the defence try and do is they try and mitigate John's appalling behaviour towards Eliza by suggesting that she's promiscuous. That
The old story. She deserved it. How does it get to court? Horwood is charged, is he?
Eliza only lasts a few more days and she dies on February the 17th. John is held in the county jail until his trial. There are stories going around about this ferocious monster and this barbaric attack. These are wild exaggerations of what we have from the witness statements, what we have from Eliza's statement, from John's statement. Local press, London papers, and in kind of halfpenny sheets. But so they're kind of creating this story. And again, that's something that the defence draw attention to, that this man has basically been tried in the face of the public, trial by media. And that's the tone that's set when John goes before that court.
Now, when he goes before the court, I know now that his trial was at the Guildhall in Bristol, which is in the city centre. But there is this weird story, because we do Rose knows this story much better than I do because she's writing a book about John Horwood. I know the story because I tell it as part of our Blood and Butchery in Bedminster tour, because I believed when I researched it that John Horwood was tried at a pub which is now called the Steam Crane, which in 1821 was the Bull, I think. But he wasn't. He was tried at the Guildhall, which would have been the assizes or the quarter sessions or something like that. That was a magistrate's court at the Bull. And what was going on?
He was tried at the Guildhall. Yeah. It was the assizes. The assizes is the only court that could levy the penalty of death. This is the most serious offence you could be tried for. But I can see maybe why this has kind of got a bit muddled. You are not going to have a capital case being tried in a pub. There's no way. But pubs were used for petty sessions. So these are magistrates' hearings without a jury where you could bring minor offences or kind of administrative matters. Pubs were used for things like that. Pubs were also used for coroner's inquests. So the coroner's inquest for Eliza was held at the Full Moon in Stokes Croft, which is still there. Violent criminals, people like that, they're going to be locked up in your county jail or your local lockups and away from the beer.
This is the difference between a proper historian and and a theatrical.
No such thing as a proper historian.
So we've got a trial at the Guildhall, not the Bull in Bedminster. No. And Horwood is found guilty of the murder of Eliza Balsum and sentenced to death.
Yeah.
And he's going to be executed. Executions were still public in 1821, weren't they?
Absolutely. And this was the first execution in the city for some years, and it was the first execution at the new jail. And you can kind of, if we imagine where the new jail was, obviously the jailhouse gates are there. So if you are kind of on Wapping Wharf, you're behind M Shed, go and stand in front of those gates. And then imagine the edifice of that prison. It was huge.
And they built a wooden scaffold above the gate, isn't that right? Yeah,
there's a scaffold above it. So this building...
I have seen drawings of it, and I remember Steve saying to me, if you lived in Bedminster, it was like a fortress on the other side of the new cut.
Yeah, this total projection of power. So the scaffold is up there, and thousands and thousands of people, of Bristolians, of people from outside Bristol, pack every single piece of ground that would command a view of the prison. And I mean every single piece of ground. You got to imagine it, not like it is now. There weren't trees, there weren't the barriers. So there were people on the banks of the cut. There were people who had been, you know, clambering up cranes over by Bathurst Basin.
I read that there were 40,000 people came out to watch this 18-year-old die in public.
Yeah. The fact that it was the first case that resulted in an execution at the New Gaol, but also the fact that this was a young man. He turned 18 when he was in prison. And that in itself, it was not that usual to hang people who were that young.
Public executions were about punishment. That was the idea. You know, if you're not careful, this is what's going to happen to you. We're showing you this as a warning. You know, there was no telly then, there was no radio, there were no mobile phones, and it was free entertainment. And so people came to watch this awful spectacle of a man dying in public. So the anticipation was so great to actually watch somebody die that people got overexcited. They were probably drinking. They would capture cats and dogs and bury them alive in the mud as a kind of bloodlust, that this was not putting them off, this was not terrorising them. This was kind of a very exciting thing to watch.
I would argue largely fiction. Never encountered the murder of animals and bloodlust and things.
So finally the waiting crowds get to see what they've come for, and this 18-year-old appears on the scaffold. The person to be hanged would be weighed and measured, and the rope for the drop would be suitable so that it would be quick. How effective was the method used to hang Horwood?
So they were concerned with making it, perhaps controlling it more. And that's one of the reasons why they start doing it on jailhouse gates, on scaffolds, on gallows like they were there, rather than kind of having the huge execution processions that would trail all the way through Bristol up to Durham Downs, and the kind of expense and chaos of that, and then having a gallows up there and the condemned standing on the back of a cart and having to be pushed off. But it's really important to remember, and Vic Gattrell writes about this, and I think it's really important, that this was never it was never really about being humane. It was about executing people. It might have been about efficiency, but it wasn't about making it nicer. You know, this was about punishment and about, as you said, deterrence. And these are still people who are being strangled to death, and strangled to death in front of a crowd of 40,000 people.
And so there are stories of relatives paying money to the executioner in order to stand beneath the gallows on the ground, and that as the body came down on the rope, they would pull on the legs to break the neck and to make it very quick and clean. And that is true, is it?
Yeah. So there are accounts of people pulling on the legs to, as you say, to break the neck. Arguably a bit more merciful end than kind of dangling there on the end of a rope, strangling slowly. And you know, it's really graphic what we're saying here, but it's the reality of it. And we tend to talk about it in so many kind of euphemisms, like this person was turned off or launched into eternity. That moment is horrific.
There must have been any kind of number of reactions from people watching this spectacle.
Absolutely. And I think that's the thing. We've kind of got this Hogarthian image of this crowd who aren't paying any attention, like you said, ballad singers and people getting drunk and throwing dogs and cats. Hogarth liked to put that in his pictures. Again, Vic Gattrell talks about people maybe laughing because they're really nervous or really scared. But there'll be all sorts of different reactions. Horwood's execution, I can never get over it. He is standing there, and in Bristol, the signal for when you're ready for it to happen is for you to drop a handkerchief. So the person who's condemned is in charge of that moment.
Oh, I didn't know that.
And Horwood stands there, and there's more than one account. He stands there holding that handkerchief for somewhere like 25 minutes in front of that crowd.
25 minutes?
25 minutes. And they're just waiting. And apparently he was praying. And the newspaper talks about the kind of awful state of suspense that the crowd are in. I'm thinking about, my God, he's an 18-year-old boy. How can you know, how can we be standing there for 25 minutes? And there's one report that says that he waited for this period of time and then turned to the prison governor and asked if he thought there would be much pain in dying. And then he turns back and it's another couple of minutes and then he drops the handkerchief. And that's when, he's hanged. From all the reports that I've encountered, it looks like Horwood died relatively quickly, which is a small mercy considering the kind of otherwise horrific nature of the whole thing.
And so the life of John Horwood ended. And it feels to me like this is the point to end part one of this story of the skeleton in the cupboard.